Hello and welcome to Road to Republic. I am Miles Eversley.
And I'm Rashid Best. In our last episode, the discussion surrounded the current system of governance in Barbados. That discussion continues now with retired Chief Justice Sir David Simmons. Sir David speaks about the role of the third branch of government, namely the judiciary.
The judicial branch is responsible for the administration of justice. And where there is a written constitution such as we have, the judiciary sees itself as the guardian of the rights of the people enshrined in that constitution, because there will be challenges between the citizen and the state, and somebody has to adjudicate and be the arbiter of that challenge, and it's the judiciary. And the judiciary is required to be impartial and independent. You take your decision without looking over your shoulder. You take your decision according to what is right in the eyes of the law, what is fair and just. If it goes against the government, too bad.
The judiciary, the main function of the judiciary is to help in maintaining order and stability in the country, and making sure that when there are conflicts between Barbadians and others, that the matters are dealt with in an impartial manner and by persons who are qualified to deal with the various issues. So we have the Caribbean Court of Justice, the Court of Appeal, and the High Court, and at the bottom is the magistracy. Now the magistracy, and you would hear on a daily basis of what magistrates are doing. Most of the cases are heard by magistrates, and they involve things like illegal possession of drugs and so on. The magistrates hear a large portion of the cases that need to be adjudicated.
Well, after that, then you go to the High Court, which is the next tier, and you have your judges who do all the heavy work, such as serious criminal cases, sitting with a jury, and they do the heavy civil cases, and they do public law cases involving the Constitution or judicial review, and they do divorce and the ancillary matters to divorce, all kinds of civil matters, intellectual property, whatever. Now, if a judge in the High Court gives a decision with which you are dissatisfied, you have the right now to appeal against that decision to the Court of Appeal. In the Court of Appeal, they try the appeals whether they're criminal or civil, and the Chief Justice is the president of the Court of Appeal, but he can also sit as a judge in the High Court. But generally he has so much work that he doesn't usually sit in the High Court. But sometimes there are heavy cases in the High Court where the chief may determine that, I think this matter requires the weight of my office. I'm going to try this. Or lawyers on both sides may get together and say, well, we want to ask the chief in his capacity as a high court judge to try it. And it happened to me with some agents from Sagicor and agents of the former Life of Barbados. There were issues as to what was the status of an insurance salesman. Was he an employee of Sagicor, or was he an independent contractor operating on his own account? I had to decide. And the two sets of lawyers came and saw me and asked me if I would do it because it was an important point of law that required decision. And I couldn't turn, but I had to do it. Now, you go to your Court of Appeal and you get your decision. Remember that the majority of decisions end there with the Court of Appeal. But you have an opportunity, if you come within the requirements for the CCJ, you can appeal then to the CCJ, their rules, and you must fit yourself within those rules. But you have the opportunity to go yet another step, to have the apex court, the CCJ, determine your rights.
Now the Caribbean Court of Justice is our final court. It used to be the Privy Council, which is based in the UK, and that was one step in the linking that I didn't mention.
All things considered, it begs the question, is the Westminster Whitehall system effective?
Westminster, the question then is this an effective form of government? I would say yes, in relation to majority rule, that the Westminster system does, in my view, allow for a greater possibility of majority rule within the political entity. I mentioned to you formerly that if we use the comparative analysis with the American system, that in the Federalist Papers, which was the ideological base for informing the constitutional work that went into building the American Constitution, the ideologues in the Federalist Papers were very clear and explicit that they did not want the majority to be a tyranny. So the design of the American political system is to inhibit what they call the tyranny of the majority. The British Westminster system, as it evolved at the end of the 19th century, with the dominance of the political parties becoming greater and the whip playing a more important role so that the people that are in a particular party can vote a particular way, that allowed for whoever got the majority in there to more or less dominate legislation. And I would say it gave stability to the Westminster system in relation to that, in a way that the American system doesn't have stability in terms of the enforcement of the majority's will. The American system may have stability in another sense. It has stability in the control of the period in time in which that people serve. But I don't know how much stabilizing thing that right now it has actually a destabilizing characteristic, because anytime a executive in the Westminster system is not performing properly, theoretically you can bring them down. That's why when people talk about having these fixed terms for prime ministers, sometimes I'm not sure we should follow the political logic of that, because the fixed terms, we have fixed terms, the 5 years. And we can extend that to anything, 5, 6, or bring it back to 3 and 2 as it was in the 40s and so on. There wasn't prime ministers then, but it was the executive. The parliament used to serve for 2 years. Then they extended it until we got the 5 years, and that's following the British example as well. But you can bring down a prime minister before that if you get him to be in a condition where he does no longer command the majority of the people within the House. And he has two options then, which are the fundamental powers of the Prime Minister. He can dissolve Parliament, call the election. He saw Erskine Sandiford do that, in 94. But when he has the majority, he can govern. Now, one of the difficulties there too is that the British now, their way of dealing with the question of the majority, I don't want to give you the impression that their establishment, their elite, was comfortable with the fact that towards the end of the 19th century they were conceding majoritarian rights to the masses. What they felt, what they had more confidence in than the Americans, was that their political culture was dominant enough to control any challenge fundamentally to their system. So we can use one example, and you all would have seen it, I think, in terms of your generation in Westminster, if you can remember that TV program. the British felt that on the basis of certain cultural influences within their political system, they could contain a majority that was potentially going too far in relation to the interests of the status quo. So if you were dealing with civil service, for instance, in Britain, I don't know how much it's changed now, but I suspect that it ain't changed that much. You will see people like Colin Laze's analysis on British politics and so on. It was still around up to quite recently. If we use the example of what I call Oxbridge, the fellows that went to Oxford and Cambridge, and who then dominate the civil service, in other words, they go up the ranks and become permanent secretaries and so on, they develop a culture in the civil service that the politicians are people that just pass through. You know, these fellas come in, be around for a number of years, probably if they're long, they'll be around for 10 years, and then they're gone. We are here forever. And they have a culture of their own, and they start developing an interest of their own, that the bureaucracy serves itself, not the government, and it preserves itself as well. So when the thing gets tight, they come together and protect themselves against any intruder. And that is what the thing Westminster is about. So they would feel they do it also in relation to the ranks in the system. And this is what people like Lears would have brought up more, that public school thing, you know, and in Britain, public school is private school. Now you can tell where a fellow comes from simply by his accent. So when you have an interview session and this person comes in to get a place in the civil service or whatever, the fellows listen to how he's speaking, and they know he didn't go, he's no Oxbridge man, and he therefore ain't getting certain things. So he went to some other place. So I just put it in a very simple and vulgar form, but it is what has been described in the literature as being an aspect of how they contain things, how they control things, in a subtle way, that they can do it by images in relation to your social background and so on. And they will keep out certain people and let in other people. And in that way they safeguard the elite and the elite's dominance within the system. So they did not have to fear the tyranny of the majority to that extent. And there are other things that would have, the system would have been designed to control. They've kept, you know, the aristocracy not as dominant as before. They have a House of Lords and all that. And there's a certain social deference to such people. And that is seen as a part of British culture and so on. So without having to say something explicitly, they are able to use instruments of social control. Some people even put it down to sometimes to religion and the language of some of the imagery within religious circles. I remember that my father used to say, he's a big Anglican, okay, that he is not going to sing that song, that hymn, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, in terms of any service that he was in charge of, because he didn't believe in it. If you look at a lot of the language of those hymns, it is feudal language. It's the language of the Middle Ages, and it's the language of a lord of the manor, of a prince and a king, and so on, and that used to be subservient to them. So the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their state. Okay? And you're supposed to sing that in church every Sunday, and it's putting on yourself, right? It's something like what the guy with this, the dictionary, you see in the dictionary, the Caribbean dictionary, Alsop said that black people should never use the word denigrate. You don't understand why? I don't think most black people understand that way. I don't know why they don't. That you don't use the word denigrate because denigrate means to turn black, to blacken. So you are saying, in the very language that you're using, you're saying if you blacken something, that is worse. And you repeat that thing in terms of your consciousness and all that every day. And you say it spontaneously and not recognize that it's actually making you condition yourself that you are inferior. So he said that word should never be used by a black person. But all that goes on. And we have those things. I don't know how you would clean up everything. But the way the constitutions deal with these systems in terms of that is to say that this particular language, wherever you see it, forget it, it means something different in terms of the contemporary constitution. It's one of the reasons we're not onto the comparative constitutional thing, but I would say that if you look at the Trinidad constitution again, you might start to think that one, I'm very pro-Trinidad, that the Trinidad constitution, in dealing with the transition to the republic, it goes through very carefully. Wherever you seek the monarch, it means the state. If you see Queen's Council, it means State Council. And it goes right through to tell people this is how we are transitioning. So don't look for every piece of paper and worry about every piece of paper having down state instead of monarch. Wherever you see monarch, it means state. And that's the way you transition. So I would presume that if we're going to do this thing, that we're going to have to use that a lot. Because you can get all these changes in bad time, and it's going to be used against you. It's going to be used to say, we can't go republic because all the letterheads and everything will get changed. But you can deal with that. You can say that wherever this whole thing was in place, the language of the new state is this. And that passes away. And that is done in legal language. You know, the legal lawyers and things would tell you that you can use the singular and mean the plural as well. So it's not inconsistent with that. So the constitutional lawyers would probably deal with that as well. But that is not constitutional. That is actually administrative. And but it is a hurdle that we might have to face in relation to trying to do a change in quick time. And the Trinidadians handle it.
While the discussion may be new to some, republics are not odd in the world, and certainly not in the Caribbean. Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, as well as territories in closer proximity to us, such as Trinidad, Guyana, and Dominica. These are examples of republics, each with their different characteristics. Ambassador His Excellency David Commichon provides further insight.
Other CARICOM countries that are also republics, we should spare a little time to reflect on Haiti, because Haiti is very important in that, in any notion of a republican government. Let's bear in mind that Haiti struck the first fundamental blow against the whole notion of slavery. You know, people talk a lot about the American Revolution and the first republic in this hemisphere, but the American Revolution was a fundamentally deficient revolution in that it accommodated slavery. The Haitian Revolution that started in 1791 set out to demolish slavery. And when Haiti consolidated its independence in 1804, Haiti then became, in a sense, the first full-fledged republic, because while the United States was still holding on to slavery, claiming to be a republic, but a republic still based on slavery, the Haitian Constitution says there can never be slavery again in Haiti, and it decreed, you know, the equality of the Haitian people. Why we might still put a question mark over its full republican status is because, you know, it fought a bloody war of independence, and the generals who fought that war were extremely powerful. And so in the first constitution of Haiti, General Dessalines, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, was made emperor, an emperor for life, but not hereditary. In other words, his offspring would not succeed to his power. But so anyhow, so that's the only question mark around the early Haitian Republic. But we have to give Haiti, so within CARICOM, Haiti is a republic. The second CARICOM chronologically, that would have become republic would have been Guyana in 1970. Guyana became independent, 66, same year as Barbados. By 1970, it had decided to become a republic. Then Trinidad followed suit. Trinidad had become independent in 1962, constitutional monarchy like Barbados. But by 1976, Trinidad too made the transition to republic. Both Suriname and Dominica, they became republics upon attaining independence. So Dominica did not go through, like Guyana or Trinidad and Tobago, a stage of independent constitutional monarchy. They went straight into the Commonwealth of Dominica as a republican situation. Similarly, Suriname. So we have those examples. I am hopeful. I am very hopeful that Barbados will set an example for the other 8 remaining monarchies. And I say so because Barbados was Britain's mother colony in the Caribbean. Barbados was the mother colony. Barbados was known as Little England. This was the center of British power, British military power, British cultural power, you name it. And if Barbados, the colony that was once known as Little England, could make that break, could make that evolution, then why can't the others do likewise? So as Barbados ambassador to CARICOM, it is my hope that what Barbados is doing will prove to be a very positive example for the others. My concept of the ultimate evolution of the Caribbean community is that, first of all, it must be a community of republics. It must be a community where its independence is fully realized, where it has taken full control of its sovereignty as a region. And so all of the existing full member states, I believe we need to make that transition to Republican status. And then I would like to see Montserrat. Well, Montserrat is a full member, although it is still a British dependency. But the 5 associate member states that are basically still British dependencies or colonies, the Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, and Anguilla and so forth. I would like what we do by fully consolidating our independence and fully developing our single market and single economy so strong. I would like that to be so reassuring and so encouraging to those remaining colonies that they not only sue for independence from Britain, but join us as full republics. So I think that is the vision we must have of our region. We began in the 17th century as a playground for European big powers, a place for European big powers to come and colonize and perpetrate genocide and enslave and plunder and loot. And we must have a vision where we who were brought here as the victims of that process, we resisted it, we transcended it, we have taken control of that space, we have turned these spaces, these locations of oppression and barbarism, we have humanized them, and we have transformed them into self-respecting nations. And we must not rest on our laurels. We must see the full mission through. And for me, the full mission has to be a totally decolonized Caribbean. No more colonies. The Caribbean still has, of all the regions of the world, the Caribbean probably still has more colonies than any other region. We need to see that there's something wrong with that. We need to correct that. And consolidating CARICOM as a grouping of republics that have made that break from having any European monarchy as its head of state, that will be a step in the right direction.
We are faced with a long 50 years of independence, and we are in a politically embarrassing situation because there is something that is standing in the way of what one might say is ultimate sovereignty, and there's a funny combination to use because sovereignty should be ultimate. And you have this thing that makes you, as a supposed sovereign people, send your legislation, your acts and so on, for final signature somewhere else. Because even if the Governor General does it here, she's doing it on behalf of this monarch that is sitting in England and in the United Kingdom. And I think that is something that is, even the British, I think, eventually will feel uncomfortable with that, as they have with the Privy Council, because they were telling us for a long time to try and get out the Privy Council, you know. And I think we could as well do that before they chase you out anyhow. So I think the time has come for that. It's taken a number of governments to be brave enough to do it. We know that in 1999, we came pretty close to it under the UN Arthur regime, and for some reason they backed off.
The manifesto of the Labour Party for 1999. There was a commitment there to move towards a republic. If you recall, a Constitution Review Commission was set up some years before, chaired by Sir Henry Ford, with Oliver Jackman and Maurice King and various other people on it. And their report came just about the time that the manifesto for the 1999 election was being prepared. And you will see in that report a clear recommendation for Barbados to become a republic. It was at the meeting in Eagle Hall that Owen committed Barbados for the launch of that manifesto. And we started work. A retreat was held at Haywood's, the hotel in St. Peter, one weekend. The point about it was this. We had the Henry Ford Commission report, which made a large number of recommendations, from the fact that the Governor General must now be a native Barbadian, no longer representative of the Queen and so on, and how the Governor General is to be appointed. Henry's commission had even drafted a bill, but we had to work through, as a cabinet, the various recommendations and say if we agree with this or agree with that. That took some time. That was tedious. By the Sunday, we worked the Saturday and the Sunday. I don't think we got a quarter way through. And then a series of events nearby derailed the movement. As you're starting to prepare, again, roll the pitch, the trouble in Trinidad with Robinson, Pandey, and Manning. Remember, go back and check and see. Trinidad was in a state, and that gave fuel to the opponents of republicanism in Barbados to advocate on the calling programs and in the press and so on. I mean, Barbados can follow Trinidad with all the confusion, and Owen Arthur always listened to the grassroots and the noises. And he felt that we should let blow over, pull back. So nothing was done. And we never got back to it. But work started. Work started.
I think that was an excellent chance because at that time you had a swing going with the government. so that popularity was no question of popularity that would cause any problems, even if some people said that they didn't want to do it. The popular will of the Barbadian people at the time was to go even more for the government between 1994 and 1999. So that would have been an excellent point to do it. In this situation, we have a 30-love victory at the last election. So you could say that the people are with the government. And in a sense, the government has a mandate to say, let's go there.
So at this point, you're probably wondering why Barbados didn't take that final step towards republicanism almost 55 years ago.
Partisan politics, quite frankly, because remember, there was a lot of contention back in the mid-60s about Barbados becoming independent. Some were contending that Barbados should continue to make an effort to develop a federation of the Eastern Caribbean. You remember we had the West Indian Federation. It collapsed in 1962 when Jamaica pulled out and Trinidad pulled out, and the two of them went to independence. And then the Barbados government, led by Mr. Barrow, was trying to reconfigure a new federation of the so-called Little Eight, the 8 Eastern Caribbean countries. And so when he found that he wasn't getting anywhere with that, and he said, Barbados is going to follow Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago and go into independence alone, it became highly contentious and highly political. Some people were saying, no, we don't agree with this. Barbados, you should be making another effort to establish this federation rather than going to independence alone. And you know how it is. Sometimes on the basis of crass political opportunism, even though something might be a good thing, but we're going to use this opportunity, to defy the government or to give them a defeat.
1966 evokes some important memories, That was the one occasion in my life when I was, for 10 days or whatever, a journalist. Because I covered that constitutional conference from London for Barbados Rediffusion and the newspaper then called the Daily News. And I saw, from a journalist's point of view, how the Constitution was hammered out. And I was close to discussing the issues with both sides, Mr. Barrow and Kamichura and so on were up there, Philip Graves. In fact, there are only 2 survivors from that conference still with us. That is Sir Henry and Sir Philip Graves. And the other 2 are the journalist, Tony Bess, who was covering it for the Advocate and CBC, and myself. We are the 4 survivors from that. No, it would not have, Barbadians would not have accepted the idea of a republic, far less the actuality of it in 1966. The notion of republic would have been anathema to them and would have savored of something like Haiti, and they would have considered themselves on the verge of being called a banana republic, which is an insult, in fact. No. And no other country in the region had gone that way. It was not the vogue thing at the time. So we came behind Trinidad and Jamaica. But now, of course, we've had all the intervening years to have seen and to have experienced the relationship with the Crown.
And so I think if you go back and read the debates at that time, there were accusations being made that if Barbados becomes independent, it will drift into dictatorship, you know. And so I think the government of the day, the DLP government led by Mr. Barrow, probably thought, look, let us move in a relatively cautious way. Let us not be too radical in the changes that we are proposing. So let us go into independence and reassure the objectors that not much will change, in that we will retain the monarch of England as our head of state, and we'll remain in the Commonwealth, etc. I think that was probably the thinking at the time, and so we lost the opportunity to really make a fundamental psychological breakthrough, because when you become independent, you really want that psychological breakthrough that you give your people, where you do it in such a decisive way that the message sinks in that, look, we are now on our own. We are now our own masters. We must build our own culture. We must paddle our own canoe, you know. And that, if you continue to have as your major secular symbol a foreign entity, and not only that, a foreign entity that was connected to your former colonial status, you are really depriving your people of the full extent of making that psychological breakthrough. But you know, and at that time, you know, several years after Barbados became independent, the British government declassified certain documents, and it was discovered that the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, that he had in fact visited Barbados just prior to Barbados becoming independent, and he had actually written letters to the then Prime Minister of Britain, Harold Wilson, advising him and imploring him to deny Barbados independence. And in his letter, he was saying that the Barbadian people are so committed to Britain that most of them don't want independence. So all of that was at play. All of that was at play, and the feeling of the government of the day was to move cautiously. But we've had 55 years of operating this system. We have had 8 governors general. I think 7 of them have been native governors general, and they have all acquitted themselves extremely well. The functions that they have been required to perform as representative in Barbados of the Queen of England, they have all performed exemplary, and so Barbadians should have absolutely no doubt that they don't need to perform those functions as anybody's agent or representative. We have people of the caliber who can perform those functions in their own right, not answering to any British authority.
As previously stated, this is not the first time Barbados is seeking to become a republic. In fact, over the decades, 2 notable reports were presented to governments on the issue of reforming the Constitution. The first commission was led by Sir Menzies Cox, which reported its findings in 1979, while the more recent commission was chaired by Sir Henry Ford. This report was presented in 1998. Professor Velman Newton speaks about these reports and their impact on the discussion surrounding governance in Barbados.
Well, the Menzies Cox Commission, like the Constitution Review Commission of 1996, which reported in 1998, they produced a fairly wide-ranging study of the Constitution, and they made lots of recommendations. But they said that there was a fair amount of support for Barbados becoming a republic, but then the Commission went ahead and did not recommend that Barbados become a republic. And I don't think they gave any reason for not going along with what people had to say. So this tells us two things. That you can have a referendum if you want, or you can have a lot of public consultation, but what the result you get is not necessarily what people might expect it should be, because you have to have proper consultation, explain to people all of the issues that could be involved. Like, for instance, you asked me how becoming a republic would affect persons in their day-to-day lives, and that is something that people are concerned about, you know, because they know so little about what it means. So in terms of public relations, I think we still have a way to go. But back to the Cox Commission. The Cox Commission recommended things like establishing a Teachers Service Commission. I think that's what it was called. This was never done. And it's still, in my view, as badly needed as it was then. The Ford Commission recommended it as well, but nothing has been done. So it means that over all this time, there are a number of issues that seemed as though they should have been resolved and fairly expeditiously, or at least that discussion should start, and nothing happened. And it says to me two things. One, the pace at which government moves, that's the move, with limited persons to assist in some of these things, and not a lot of money to hire consultants. And secondly, that unless the public is made aware at every step of what you're recommending and why, they too lose the momentum to try to make the persons who are in government, like the executive, move towards making change. I believe there was some political fallout somewhere along the line in relation to the Cox Commission, but I don't really know. In relation to the Ford Commission, there were steps after 1998. There was a draft referendum. There was a referendum bill which was passed both houses. Both political parties spoke of having a referendum and of going to Republican status. But nothing happened. For some reason, it never seemed to be something that they felt you would drop everything else and push towards. And that brings us to the question why it might be so now. In my view, we have a prime minister who wants to have things done and fast. And she might well have asked, if not now, when? After looking back at the history of the movement towards the Republic in Barbados. And I agree with her. No self-respecting country with a constitution that was born from a British order in council, and now one of the few independence constitutions across the world that is still in this state, should want to linger around, you know, without moving to the final step. It is just that, to me, since last November, I believe, a lot of time would seem to have elapsed if nothing having been done. But remember, you had COVID, we had the ashfall, and then we had Elsa, is it? So there have been a lot of national upheavals that could have resulted in some delay. Even now, the review committee that is working can have, there are lots of public events and so on they could have. But always in the back of your mind is COVID. Because COVID is, I don't think, is going anywhere in a hurry. And you always have to think of how it should be contained. And the cheapest way of preparing persons for a change in status of government, the way we would have to move to Republican status, would be if it was possible to have mass political meetings and lots of big gatherings where you could deal with lots of issues before lots of people at the same time. And unfortunately, that has not been possible. But all is not lost. And my view is, if the Prime Minister thinks we should go for it. And I think there are good grounds on which we should take that stance at this time. Let's try and go for it. And the thing is, you can change the status of the Governor General to that of President by amending the present Constitution. What you would do is wherever you have Governor General, you place it with President for the time being. And then, after that, hopefully things would be in a position next year where we could see the bigger picture. We could then move towards replacing the Constitution. But you have to have major consultations because you're going to be thinking of the public service, which I'm sure needs a lot of overhaul. You're going to be thinking of the judiciary. You're going to be thinking of the public finances, the Auditor General and his status, all of the things provided in the Constitution. You will now need Parliament. You will now need to have specialized committees and have dialogue with persons as to where you should go in connection with all those branches of the Constitution. That could take a year. It could take longer. But by the time you're finished with that exercise, you should be ready with the public having been brought along. And I'm not speaking about a referendum. I'm talking about public consultation and all these facets, using the internet, public meetings, literature in shops and supermarkets and doctor's offices and so on, just to make sure people know where we're going. And then you would have a new constitution.
I would go minimalist at first. In other words, all you're going to do is deal with the head of state and remove the British monarch and bring in a presidential post and maintain the parliamentary system. And then tell people in Barbados that this is a stage in our independence where we have to make changes to governance. And then you break it down. That you can, if just for example, you say, let's discuss whether we can remain bicameral. And then you have a discussion like that. You don't know how long that'll go on. It may go on for 6 months, may go on for 2 years. People preferably would hope that some of these things would be settled more quickly. What you would not have is a set of people then saying, you got to go to a referendum. Because all you can do is make a very minimalist change at the beginning and then say that you would take that as a precursor to governance reforms. And that is how I would approach it. That you use the change, which is the critical thing in relation to moving the monarchy, and then use that change, where you are now a republic, to say, I will now proceed in stages, after discussion and whatever else, to governance reforms, which would give us a better system. The reason why you will go that way to not in too drastic a set of procedures is that normally, if you're doing drastic constitutional change, is because the country has politically reached ground zero. That would happen in the rare cases of revolutionary politics. If you have revolutionary politics, what happens is all the institutions crash. They either crash, and that has brought about the revolution, or the revolution overthrows them. And then what often happens in a situation like that is something that's called a constituent assembly is established, where the forces that are part of the revolutionary process, they come together and decide to say, this is the kind of government that we want to have. And you call that a constituent assembly. That constituent assembly has one job, to put together a constitution, and then it disbands. Because what is going to follow in terms of governance is what the Constituent Assembly says. So it has no purpose after it has done that. That is a very complicated thing to do, though, okay? Especially in a situation where you have normal relations going on. Because that is something that comes out of a crisis, out of a crash, out of people going down to ground zero. That's not going to happen in Barbados, okay, if it will ever happen. But if it were to happen, then one could go that route and set up a constituent assembly. In fact, you will have to. You almost be compelled to, because you won't have anything in place. So you have to rebuild the government.
I think that the Henry Ford Commission was very clear on the fact that Barbados should proceed to a republic. I don't recall that any specific time frame was set for it, but it is something that clearly has been discussed by our leaders, and one might say almost put on the back burner for a while. So I think that the transition to a republic is an essential step for Barbados to take. When our last Prime Minister started talking about it a few years before the last election, I was a little concerned as to whether moving to republic status after the problems that we were seeing in Central America and especially Venezuela might put off investors in Barbados, because the republican status of the so-called banana republics and the recent transition of Venezuela into an extremely profitable oil-producing country into a country on its knees just might make foreigners, people outside who might contemplate investment, a little bit worried. That era has passed. My concerns have passed, and I could only say that what Henry Ford said was appropriate, and that the progression to a republic is essential for the sense of, if you wish to say pride, or pride and industry, of the majority of Barbadian people.
I prepared a document called the Barbados Constitution, Facts and Questions, and I did a paper on local government, and as consultant to the Commission, I sat on a number of the hearings. I certainly assisted in analyzing the data that came before the Commission. And my daughter was a member of the Commission, and she represented the youth of Barbados, and she was a very vocal, person, had views on everything. So, there was a lot of discussion as to what the Commission was doing, where it should be going, and so on. The Ford Commission, I think it was an attempt to make sure that on that occasion, that everything was done in the right way. And they had time, they didn't have COVID and these other things to cope with. So the Commission was established in 1996. It had several public hearings. Persons submitted reports. There was a session for the youth of the country. A lot of the youth were not really concerned because they knew very little about the Queen. When I was a little girl at school, we sang the national anthem, I don't know how often. You knew about the Queen. If any member of the royal family were coming, you had to line the streets to wave flags, and you were given juices and buns and so on for your efforts. But the generation of Barbadians, young Barbadians, from about the time of the Ford Commission, and even more so now, don't feel that affiliation to the royal family and Britain as we would have felt, say, 40, 50 years ago. Because we've been standing on our own 2 feet for all that time. The members of the royal family come to Barbados, yes, from time to time, but there's that, not that, it's not being drilled in us that we are part of them or they are part of us, or we depend on them. So if you want to say that the youth of the country might not be in favor of it, I think we should forget that. I think we should forget that, because there's nothing to indicate that there are more youth now who would want, now that we've been kind of removed from one step from the monarchy, who would think that it is going to be more detrimental now than it was then. I cannot think of any reason why we would not want to become a republic at this stage. I can't. They went to England, Canada, and the US, where large segments of Barbadians were living, and had consultations with them. And every opportunity was taken to make sure that persons knew what the Commission was doing, what its terms of reference were, and so on. And after all that, the commissioners would meet and they'd go through all of the evidence and come to their decisions. They made a lot of recommendations. I cannot remember all of them. Getting on. But by and large, I would say they were based on what people actually felt and wanted. For instance, a majority of Barbadians wanted the Republican status after having been explained what it was all about. But of course, there were some who felt, oh, the Queen would turn her back on us. They wouldn't give us any more loans. You know, the British sovereignty is part of our history. Other countries will look down on us and so on. Those were minority. Most of the other persons, both here and overseas, saw that there were advantages. And in many respects, it was not monetary advantages, but it was the feeling of knowing that the country in which you were raised or which you were born had felt enough confidence in itself to become a republic, which means that it would no longer need to be a part of the British, to have the British Queen, the Queen of England, Her Majesty the Queen, as head of state. And the understanding was that Barbados would remain a part of the Commonwealth, which means we would benefit from expertise and from dialogue with other countries that had been in the same circumstances as we were, and that basically the tangible changes would be change of, some said, Queen Elizabeth Hospital to something else, and remove Royal from the police force, and others said remove anything that had Royal or Queen or anything. Those were the few extremists, yeah? But basically, most people did not think that having been exposed to what it meant, felt that it would be to the detriment of the country. But here we are. Let us not look back. Let us move to where we should be moving, and as soon as possible, and with as little acrimony as possible. That's what I would say.
Well, Rashid, that brings us to the end of this, the third episode of Road to Republic. Until next time, I am Miles Eversley.
And I'm Rashid Best. Thanks for joining us.